Thank you for being here. The first day of Amaze. I can't believe I'm here and that I got the invite. Oftentimes, you get an invite to be somewhere, and the invite is to spend $700 to buy a ticket to go there. And they actually wanted to actually bring me here. So I'm very, very thankful. So, yeah, this song talk is "Put Your Glock Away, I've Got a Stronger Weapon for You," and the words behind here are words from an Outkast song, which that line comes from. And it's basically about, I want to talk about the intersections of how violence can be very complicated. So, I mean, who am I? I'm working, best known for this game. It's called Treachery Beatdown City. It's a side-scrolling brawler mixed with turn-based RPG elements, but that's not really, I mean, that's the interesting part, but I like to call it a dark comedy set in an alternate reality called East Fulton, where the President Barack Obama is in his third term of presidency, and he's kidnapped by Ninja Dragon terrorists, and you have to go find him with three marginalized superheroes, and because the city's billionaire mayor is basically trying to cover everything up. For other reference, I worked on this game, which is completely non-violent, which I started working on Treachery and Beatdown City about full-time in 2012, and also that same year during the Global Game Jam, I worked on this game, which ended up on Kotaku. I used to work at Rockstar Games also, and I was sitting at Rockstar when this game was put up on Kotaku, and I felt more proud that this game was on Kotaku than the games I was working on at Rockstar. And so kind of the description of this is you are this like amorphous thing at the bottom, and the world is zooming in and things are coming towards you. And the description that we gave it was, we are small objects in the universe, and there are many objects that will come our way. Our goal is to avoid those objects to continue the cycle. I also got to work on this game, which is called Corporate Vandals, which is an 8-player asymmetric turf warfare role-playing game where players use stickers and markers on wall-mounted boards to recreate and tackle the struggle of what it's like to be an independent graffiti artist, the corporations that co-opt those tactics, the nonprofits that stand up to those corporations, and the cold, unfeeling city government. The first time this game was played at the NYU No Quarter event, which it was commissioned for, it started a fight between two guys and a dog. I think the dog was just excited to be a part of it. And I also work on political art. I worked on this, which is called Being Black in America. And this piece was it was definitely, absolutely a critique on the police state that's becoming of America, but also it was a critique of the inclusion of Corey Archangel's piece Clouds in the Whitney Biennial, which reuses clouds from Super Mario Brothers, where they don't attribute the art to Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto. Also dealing with the relevance of art in general. Can appropriated game art tell a meaningful narrative? I posted this piece on Twitter where I feel like that's like the new art gallery, essentially, where RTs are essentially curators. And it garnered a lot of views, but it also garnered a lot of weird, apathetic, and racist commentary, which I always screenshot and keep. So the point in my game development process was basically over the last 5 years, I've sort of had a bit of a re-education. I started thinking about my game tastes, and they started to change. I became less interested in shooting mass amounts of people and more into in-your-face, very personal combat scenarios. And I also started questioning what I was actually doing as a game designer. I started also kind of on the path leaving Rockstar. I started going back to art museums, questioning those spaces, and music started to take over my life because of kind of Spotify. I started having more of a yearning for more recent history, especially that which led to the creation of hip hop as a visual style, music, dance, and overall style of art. And I started reading a lot of articles, poems, and books by revolutionary thinkers. And I think out of everything, the major turning points were the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson by the police, the subsequent murders by the state that seemed to kind of come every other day from then, and the rise of activism around them, and most recently, the political climate, obviously. So the combination of all that has informed my practice about what I'm doing, what I am, how the relationship with my games continues to change and evolve, and unpacking why I'm making a game where you essentially creatively punch people. So I want to start talking about this. Sense of anything, I feel like you have to go back to the point, a breaking point, and so I kind of got to the civil rights era coming back from studying a lot of hip hop and studying. I gave a talk at Indiecade back in 2013, I think, where it was about why are there so few black and brown creators in the game space, and I started to look back at how hip hop was a art form that was created in the Bronx by people who basically had nothing. They would plug tape decks and speakers into street signs, street lamps, and wherever they could find power. So they were basically creating technology out of nothing. And also how a lot of people got the tools that they needed through there was a blackout and people just stole it. Like graffiti paint, like spray paint is oftentimes stolen. Like a lot of these things were the way to create art meant that you had to basically just break down the entire system that was wrapped around it. So the first tenet I want to talk about is nonviolence. This is talking about nonviolence with the explicit goal of never striking back against people who may strike you. And, you know, it's really came to a head with Rosa Parks, but in that time, very recent history, if you were black, the refusal to give up your bus seat, if you used the wrong bathroom, ate at a lunch counter, or basically looked or spoke at someone the wrong way, you'd be met with vile insults, physical violence, and arrest of the oppressed. The system existed as an extension of slavery, keeping black people legally separate from whites. Dr. Martin Luther King would organize peacefully to try to gain equality for all black people. He would boycott and otherwise peacefully protest against businesses with a focus of being anti-segregation and to end unfair laws. Notable are the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted over a year, the Birmingham campaign to end lunch counter segregation, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, that's where he gave the famous I Have a Dream speech, and unfortunate events like Bloody Sunday, a march where he could not be present from, where the mob and police attacked all the protesters, and it made headlines, aka being called Bloody Sunday.
Of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers, as I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence.
That's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. So, yeah, so MLK struggled definitely with people who were basically having to struggle with the same thing where he told them to be nonviolent when the government wanted to pick up people and send them to a country to murder other people when they themselves did not have rights. So I want to move on to this terminology, which a lot of this is about how a lot of the civil rights movement was inherently nonviolent, but because the words used sounded a little scary, that's when people started calling people violent. So these words were used by Malcolm X in reference to bring about civil rights to black people, of all black people. And these were scary because they were not tacitly nonviolent. He spoke about how people would, if they were being attacked, that they should have the right to fight back. And the way that Malcolm X delivered speeches was basically the primary threat. People listened to him, and that's what made him scary. But they just didn't like the people on the outside, and the media especially did not like the words he used and how he used them. They didn't like the amount of people that came to hear him talk, and they didn't like the influence that he had. So this is an interview with him, where you can basically kind of see how people treated him. Basically, they would turn his words around while talking to him.
Muslims have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Well, that's something of an argument, but I've heard speeches made by some of the people of your group. I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating, well, I would have to describe, I think, as violence to meet the serious injuries that have been done your people, with which I totally agree.
I don't call that violence. I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of those human beings.
So when a minister from an objectively marginalized group plainly states that he only believes in reprise for being attacked and doesn't believe in and doesn't tell people to go start violence on their own, and on TV someone tells him that they disagree, up to words that he basically says again, and then the guy says, well, that is a basis for an argument, but then he also doubles back and then wants to move on to a different topic. This is basically this is very weird, because they're saying he's an advocate for hate and violence, and when he says he's not, that means that there's this real belief under there, and they're telling people constantly that he is this. They're using his words against him by taking them out of context. So the right to self-defense, the Black Panther Party, known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, was primarily a socialist and anti-capitalist group, and their goal was meant for ending both the exploitation and violence by the state, exploitation of the people and violence by the state. And to quote one of their leaders, Fred Hampton, "We got to face the fact that some people, say you fight fire best with fire, but we say you fight fire best with water. We say you don't fight racism with racism, we're going to fight racism with solidarity. We say you don't fight capitalism with black capitalism, you fight capitalism with socialism." The right to self-defense was a way of subverting the violence that black people face daily. The Black Panthers would carry guns legally to observe arrests and police the police. One of their other founding members, Huey Newton, he would often carry a law book with his gun. And they would occupy buildings seeking justice. One time they occupied a Capitol building, and immediately after, a bill forbidding open carry was made law for all of California, which is completely opposite of what happened recently when a white militia occupied a building in Burns, Oregon, just last year. Their actions, the Black Panthers' actions, were not to actively engage in violence, but to own their right for self-defense only if force was used against them. And this had them labeled as felons and terrorists. At this point, the Black Panther Party was feared for serving breakfast. In May of 1969, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, sent a memo to all FBI offices. The Breakfast for Children program represents the best and most influential activity going for the BPP, and as such is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. And what do they stand for? Solidarity. That solidarity was an enemy to the state. So much so that they conspired to kill one of their leaders, Fred Hampton. This is actually intentionally really dark, and I'll explain in a second. So later in 1969, the FBI would coordinate with the local Chicago Police Department and, working also with an informant, mapped out and plotted the murder of Fred Hampton. And some of these aspects, a lot of this comes from the Chicago Tribune, and is a little bit summarized, mostly taking out just extra stuff. So 8 police officers crept into the front of a tattered 2-building flat on the Chicago's west side. Another 6 officers were at the back door. Inside, 9 people slept in the first floor apartment where 19 guns and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition were stored. The next 7 minutes of gunfire became one of the most hotly disputed incidents in the turbulent 1960s. After the shooting stopped, Illinois Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, 21, and Peoria, Illinois leader Mark Clark, 22, were dead. The Chicago PD tried to frame the Black Panther Party for shooting first, but, and going back to the Chicago Tribune, months later, a federal investigation showed that only 1 shot was fired by the Panthers, although that number remained in dispute because they were sleeping. Police fired 82 to 99 shots. This slide is a painting by the artist Kerry James Marshall, who had just had a massive 2-story show at the Met Brower in New York. And this piece is much darker. This piece, maybe it's about this dark in person. It's black acrylic paint on black fiberglass, and it is a picture of, his idealized imagination of the moments before Fred Hampton was killed. You can see the Black Panther flag on the side. There's a lot of books strewn around. It's one of those moments where you actually have to be in the room to see the painting to really understand it. A lot of his paintings are very painted with a lot of black paint, and so it's one of those cases where you just have to go. So if you ever can, go see it. Kerry James Marshall. So now I want to hear from Angela Davis, who left the Black Panther Party and decided to go just work more in the Communist Party, actually, and how after she was arrested one day.
That's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman, and I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing, and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
So this is when she was in jail, and she was in jail because of the following actions. In 1970, a 17-year-old used guns that were purchased by Angela Davis to take hostages, including a judge and some jurors. During the getaway, the police fired on the car, killing the judge and 3 black men, plus injuring a juror and a prosecutor. The guns were purchased by Angela Davis days prior, but she was not present for what happened. Because of California law, however, she was charged with aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder of the death of the judge. So the judge that was killed by the police, she was charged for. She was put on the FBI's most wanted list, and when she was apprehended by the FBI eventually, the president himself congratulated the FBI on bringing in a terrorist. Eventually, after a long-fought battle, she was freed, but not without a large amount of work by lawyers, protesters, and committees on the outside. And the very fact that a person who wasn't even in the room for a crime was labeled a terrorist speaks to a desperation to destabilize, lock up, and silence the growing resistance. Also, months before this arrest, she was fired from her job twice, her teaching job at UCLA, once because of pressure from Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, because she was a communist. And they said that she had no business teaching at a U.S. institution. So now moving on to Black Power, and this is another concept that is inherently called violent. It was first mentioned by this man, Stokely Carmichael, seen here walking peacefully with Martin Luther King. And then, but after a growing number of arrests and basically being very tired of the slow progress of civil rights, he gave up and he kind of basically leveled up. He gave this speech about the right to Black Power. And in this speech, here's an excerpt. We have to talk about wars and soldiers and just what that means. A mercenary is a hired killer, and any black man serving in this man's army is a black mercenary, nothing else. A mercenary fights for the country for a price and does not enjoy the rights of the country for which he is fighting. A mercenary will go to Vietnam to fight for free elections for the Vietnamese, but doesn't have free elections in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. A mercenary goes to Vietnam and gets shot fighting for his country, and they won't even bury him in his own hometown. He's a mercenary, that's all. We must find the strength to say, so that when they start grabbing us to fight their war, we say, hell no. We have to talk about nonviolence among us, so that we don't cut each other on Friday nights and don't destroy each other, but move to the point where we appreciate and love each other. That's the nonviolence that has to be talked about. The psychology the man has used on us has turned us against each other. He says nothing about the cutting that goes on Friday night, but talk about raising one fingerprint towards him, and that's when he jumps up. We have to talk about violence among us first, nonviolence among us first. And, this speech basically, what about this speaks inherently to violence? It's more, we will fight back if we are fought, but we also shouldn't fight wars for people that won't fight for our rights. The word power in Black Power muddles it up for many because they don't understand that white power means the status quo, so Black Power would purely be challenging that status quo. And in the speech, it does say bits about how you have to strike back against the oppressors, but again, that should be expected. So the conclusion of the civil rights era saw multiple leaders have their movements murdered, many more were beaten and imprisoned, and history was written demonizing most of them. A lot of what happened in these moments pushed the U.S. forward, but some things today convince us that not much has changed. Words are powerful. MLK used the word nonviolence repeatedly, and as a Christian man, he was given a holiday, but not before speaking out about the poor and capitalism and war, which cost him his life. And his radical politics scrubbed from his persona posthumously. The system still got him. Many others demanded the right to fight back when aggressed upon. Malcolm X did it with a fiery tongue and pointing out the hate in people's hearts. Many brought up the hypocrisy of a warmongering nation wanting Black people to go and die for the country that treated them as less than. So now I want to jump forward to 1998 in the movie Slam. The main character, Ray Joshua's life is changed with a gunshot. His friend and weed dealer is shot in the face by an unknown shooter, and Ray is arrested while fleeing the shooting. Though not guilty of the shooting, he was found with a small amount of weed, and he was told that he would get a few years if he copped a plea, or more if he fought it in court, where he would inevitably lose. He had to succumb to the system or be eaten by it. Right before this next moment, he is told that he has to join a gang in order to avoid getting beaten up, and so he uses his words to get out of the fight.
I stand on the corner of the block slinging amethyst rocks, drinking 40s of Mother Earth's private nectar stock, dodging cops, cause 50B the 666, and I need a fix of that purple rain, the type of shit that drives membranes insane. Oh yeah, I'm in the fast lane, snorting candy yams that free my body and soul and send me like Shazam. Never question who I am, God knows, and I know God personally. In fact, he lets me call him me. Yeah, I'm serious, B. Doggone niggas plotted shit lovely, but the feds is also plotting me. They're trying to imprison my astrology, put our stars behind bars, our stars in stripes, using blood-splattered banners as nationalist kites. But I control the wind, that's why they call it the hawk. I am Horus, son of Isis, son of Osiris, worshipped as Jesus, resurrected like Lazarus. But you can call me lazy. Yeah, I'm lazy because I'd rather sit and build than work a plow field, worshiping a daily yield of cash green crops. Stealing us was the smartest thing they ever did. Too bad they don't teach the truth to their kids. Our influence on them is the reflection they see when they look into their menstrual mirror and talk about their culture. Their existence is that of a schizophrenic vulture. Yeah, there's no repentance. They are bound to live an infinite consecutive executive life sentence. So what are you bound to live, nigga? So while you're out there serving the time and I'll be in sync with the sun while you run from the moon. Life of the womb reflected by guns. Worship of moons, I am the sun, and we are public enemies number one. One, one, one. One, one, one.
Forgot what the fuck I was thinking.
So yeah, rather than getting himself further into the prison system and accepting that he needs to join a gang or be free, he knows that he's already in prison. Therefore, he uses his words to solve this issue. He doesn't believe he belongs there. At no point does he agree that the circumstances which he is in, and he does not accept that prison is an inevitability. As a character, he uses the words often, but is not always able to get out of all situations, like the prison that he is in, which is a system that is rigged to keep him and many others stuck. Or personal responsibility, as he eventually gets bailed out by this man because he thinks he's smart and deserves to be free. But bail just means that you have to go back and plead your case eventually anyway. He thinks about whether or not he should even go back to prison or not, and he's told that maybe he has to, because if he doesn't go back, this guy loses out on all the money. And basically he's letting him down. So it's all about tough choices. So using words can break systems, but they can't always break all the systems, and they can't always solve everything. So, after a lot of this heaviness, I'm going to now move more towards video games. And so let's talk about Undertale. So I started this talk about nonviolence, and I talked about how even with the intent to not start any violence, where your thought is purely nonviolent, then those words can be twisted and used against you. Things can often skew very quickly, and in Undertale, the game is, with nonviolence at its core belief, the game plays very differently if you kill anyone. And if you play it like a traditional role-playing game, the game begs for forgiveness, and you are the monster. But if you're a pacifist, most of the world is out to get you, if not to make you listen to them. You are an outsider, and you were taught that you were taught that you have basically two options in this world. You can talk and dodge, or murder, fight, or spare. As Undertale is a game about words and avoiding violence, because you are an outsider and the world is actively unfriendly because of what your ancestors did, this game has a very simplistic idea of what race and violence is. In the beginning, you're protected by a person who treats you nicely as a form of manipulation. The actions you pick are passive. What you say isn't always yours to choose, and just intent, which is also vague and uncomfortable. Although you know that the game is just that, a game, and even then multiple monsters will attack you, and you have to just keep dodging them and dodge more and more violent attacks. Eventually, you are accosted by the head of the police state in the land, and in this world, they deem you a threat. So you must die so that they may prosper. And so a chase begins. The moment is terrifying, although as a player of a video game with the aesthetic that it does, you get the wind early that it's really just a threat of terror and everything is going to be okay. Everything will be all right, which is a knowledge that most people do not have in a real world situation. And I have to ask, is teaching an active refusal of self-defense and accepting abuse as a game mechanic acceptable? Especially when it becomes, as RPGs with random encounters tend to do, repetition of play. In general, because there are so many repeats, there is this illusion of affecting change. Undertale lulls you into a complacency, and you build toward being forced to flee the police all of a sudden. After the prolonged chase, which spans multiple screens, the officer is overcome with heat. They pass out on the floor. You are safe. You are free of the violence. But because Undertale expects an inhuman amount of kindness from the player, you must give your attacker some water, or else it is considered you are considered to be their murderer. It is not only okay for the player to escape, but you must show some extra kindness to your attacker. Again, I think this is a dangerous lesson to teach people. Go beyond what is humanly expected for your attackers. This is a performative kindness for the sake of satisfying the game's requirements. The charm is dissonant with the fear you were meant to feel moments before. And with this, I want to put out the notion that nonviolence or pacifism can also be used as a term of manipulation. So moving on towards what we consider, I guess, acceptable violence. So in boxing, while being black is actually a form of performative critical play, because seeing as how living in a society where in 1955 a young boy, Emmett Till, who was 14, was beaten up, mutilated, shot, thrown in a river for purportedly flirting with a white woman. No one was convicted, and decades later, the woman confessed that nothing actually happened. With a climate like that in the 50s, you can only imagine that in the early 1900s and late 1800s, that the ability to fight your oppressors is huge. It's a political statement in and of itself, and regardless of how the participants felt, it changed the nature of the sport. This is Jack Johnson, the first black boxer to win the World Heavyweight Championship as opposed to the World Colored Heavyweight Championship. He won it in 1908, decades before the Civil Rights Movement. And he was the World Colored Heavyweight Championship was the only heavyweight title available to black men until Jack broke those lines. And it took waiting for a couple of several white champions who ended up retiring, citing no challengers remaining, which really meant except the black ones. From a Viceland article, in boxing, black men had won lower weight division championships before, but what was up with the heavyweight? So the heavyweight title was considered the pinnacle of manly achievement. It was absolute. The absolute best fighter in the world was white, and that was what mattered. When Johnson won it, it bestowed the title of His Fistic Majesty, and they used to call Sullivan, on a fighter from an inferior race. The fight with Burns, where he won the belt, only happened because the media pushed for it, and he was offered $30,000 by the promoter in Australia to agree to the fight. Johnson, as a fighter, basically subverted the sport too, because he used heavy grapple-focused in boxing, which is basically unheard of, and he was basically unstoppable because of the way that he fought, where he would slow the pace of the match. And because of this, eventually the same media that wanted him to have a title shot said that no one would pay to see two black men in the ring fight. So he basically had to now be the new person who never fought another black person. Eventually, this man, Jim Jeffries, who used to be a champion, who was one of the champions who declined to fight him, saying that he was not eligible, eventually lost. And when Johnson beat Jeffries, it caused race riots. White men committed suicide, citing that if the best white man, Jim Jeffries, would lose in a match, then there was not a life worth living. And all footage of the fight was banned, with Teddy Roosevelt, the US president, supporting the ban because he was a fan of boxing the way it was supposed to be. Jack Johnson didn't fit into what people wanted out of a champion. He would buy lavish things and having relationships with white women. He would go on to eventually be politically exiled because the media and white America wanted nothing more to do with him and his private life shortly after he lost his title. Because of this, it wasn't until 1937, almost 30 years later, that another black man would be allowed to challenge for it. It was Joe Louis. But he actually had a PR, he had handlers who basically said that he had a list of do's and don'ts from his handlers, which included everything from smiling at white women or after knocking out an opponent to publicly eating watermelon. And later, Muhammad Ali unifies the belt under his given name, Cassius Clay. After winning the belt and unifying it, he then used this win to announce to the world that he was Muhammad Ali, a Muslim, essentially using the stage of the sport to promote his beliefs. And Muhammad Ali, who died recently, was the victim of the same historical scrubbing as Martin Luther King. anti-Muslim racists today ignore that Muhammad Ali, their favorite boxer, was a Muslim. This was also entrenched in who he was, despite during the lead up to one fight with this fighter, Ernie Terrell repeatedly called Ali Clay, much to Ali's annoyance. Ali called Cassius Clay his slave name. The two almost came to blows over this name issue in a pre-fight interview, so Muhammad Ali went into the fight to humiliate Terrell. And so in the fight, after Muhammad Ali had bloodied Terrell in the 7th round, he shouted at him, "What's my name, Uncle Tom? What's my name?" The fight went on for 8 more rounds because when he could have finished him, he decided to make it last. Therefore, essentially using the boxing ring as a way to say, "I'm Muhammad Ali. If you don't believe that otherwise, I'm gonna beat it out of you." People also forget that Muhammad Ali was a good friend of Malcolm X. So boxing, while being black, is inherently a political statement because of the way that the system that boxing, while being black, is in. Moving on to how boxing is portrayed in video games. This is Punch-Out, the arcade game that Nintendo released with these somewhat dubious character designs. And, the racialized nature of boxing was embraced by Nintendo thoroughly, all of the stereotype and some of the technique, because, Punch-Out is one of my favorite games, right? It's a game that's still being pulled apart. And it's a game that's really great about like varying fighting styles and tells a great story, except when it tries to do it through the drawings of people and writing and their names. But it basically has none of the critical understanding. This can be seen with how Nintendo was fascinated with Mike Tyson enough to put him on the cover, making him one of the first black men to be on a game cover. And because of the obvious lack of understanding about the deeper racialized nature of boxing, the complicated nature of being black and being a boxer, and I guess they only ever saw Rocky Marciano story arc as one worth telling, they ignored what it was like to be a black boxer, basically upheld the idea that no one wants to see 2 black men fight in a ring, which by this time was absolutely not true. And when Mike Tyson's contract was expiring, Nintendo opted to replace him with a poorly designed white guy, Mr. Dream, unpictured. And this is a kind of an issue in games in general, right? Both Street Fighter and Punch-Out have histories rife with racism, and one of the legacies of Street Fighter is this man, Balrog. They update his look every time, and even his playstyle, but they maintain their caricature of Mike Tyson as a money-grubbing, basically like a boxer that you wouldn't like, because he's always a bad guy in all of those games. Like, there's no reason to ever like him. And even Street Fighter 2 used to start with the 2 men fighting and one of them being a black man punched out by a white guy, which they ended up editing because people criticized it. And Nintendo's just as bad here too. This the guy on the left is Doc Lewis, and many people believe that he's based on Joe Louis. And what's interesting is that he has a bit of a bio that says that he in his past, he has about a 1-sentence bio in the NES booklet, and it says that he came to prominence in 1955. So just think about that about his history, and that Nintendo decided to then say, okay, well, you know what the best thing to do is that Doc Lewis from 1955 is going to train a white kid from the Bronx to fight all of the racial stereotypes. So now I want to move on to martial arts, but mostly Bruce Lee, because Bruce Lee, his approach in life is more important than this talk is even going to touch upon. But he believed in following Kung Fu or Gang Fu, improving his martial arts technique to lead him to create a philosophy of fighting and less a style which he called Jeet Kune Do. He took a view of traditional martial arts techniques that they were too rigid and formalistic to be practical in scenarios of chaotic street fighting. Lee decided to develop the system with an emphasis on practicality, flexibility, speed, and efficiency. To quote him, "I have not invented a new style, composite, modified or otherwise that is set within distinct form as apart from this method or that method. On the contrary, I hope to free my followers from clinging to styles, patterns, or molds. Remember that Jeet Kune Do is merely a name used, a mirror in which we see ourselves. Jeet Kune Do is not an organized institution that one can be a member of. Either you understand or you don't, and that is that. Basically, he believed that one must never become stagnant in the mind or method and always involve and moving towards improving itself. So he was a star in a lot of movies. I like Chinese Connection or Fist of Fury a lot because it is a movie about ethnic identity where a Japanese oppressor is keeping this dojo down, and Bruce Lee does the thing that he only can do: violence in the face of oppression. So this movie, this is a quote from another article. Lee tapped into a powerful sentiment that the normally undemonstrative Chinese audience of the time stood up and applauded. The tag of "sick man of Asia" was used in the 30s by the Japanese imperialist forces to describe the subjugated Chinese, and in this movie, Lee exacts a visceral vengeance of mesmerizing power. And basically the crossover appeal of martial arts and the civil rights movement. In the 1970s, Lee was a rare non-white leading man and an unfeasibly cool one at that. His 4 completed films amounted to a picture of the world in which oppression, whether from drug lords, Japanese imperialists, or cat-executing pseudo-Bond villains, was swatted aside with hyperkinetic ultra-violence. You can see why this creed of righteous self-reliance appealed to black audiences who were emerging from the civil rights struggles but were still the subject of plenty of prejudice. This is Jim Kelly, the first black martial arts star, who ended up becoming also a blaxploitation star. You can see the influence in this movie, The Last Dragon, where the protagonist is peaceful, he's constantly taunted by a brash opponent, and it eventually becomes time to fight back when his rival goes after his family. It eventually kills his rival, Show Nuff. And basically, it's about fighting back when necessary. And this leads towards the beat-em-up genre. Beat-em-up genre is widely attributed to Yoshihisa Kishimoto. He was a guy who liked Bruce Lee movies. He fought in high school a lot and enjoyed video games. So his first game, he's pitched to Technos, the company that he wanted to work at instead of Data East, was for a game about resulting fights, as well as his love for Bruce Lee movie Enter the Dragon. It would be a single-player brawler centered around a high school student getting into scuffles with local street toughs. And Technos agreed, and Kunio-kun was born. At this time, and this is a quote from Kishimoto, at this time, there were a lot of shoot-'em-up games, Kishimoto remembers, but I wanted to create something more realistic because I thought it was a good solution to make users feel involved when playing a game. They were already fighting games like Spartan X, Kung Fu Master, or Karateka at the time, but the mechanics of all fighting games were similar to shoot-'em-ups where you hit one enemy 1 or 2 times, he disappears from the screen. As for the other karate games, they were clean sports games. I wanted a dirtier and more realistic fighting game. I wanted an action game in which you felt every kick and punch. You just have to see the character's animation in Kunio-kun to understand that it hurts, and just violence, and such violence was pretty new at the time. And this is an example of that Kung Fu game. Yes. That's all that game is about. And you can see his game
ってね。
Starts as a high school brawl between him and his best friend, so he has to go rescue his best friend's honor and fight in this train station. I mean, already you can see this idea of them being outnumbered. People have weapons. The animation is very over the top. And then he ended up working on Double Dragon, because they needed a more international themed game for the sequel, and because he loved Enter the Dragon so much, he put double at the beginning of it because it was a 2-player game. So they focused on the 80s post-apocalypse biker theme because that, I guess, was more international because of movies like Streets of Fire being big at the time, instead of a personal school story. But the interesting thing here was the idea of more individual characters. Very specific designs that tied everything together. It was easy to know what was coming from each enemy and to choreograph easier. This was all important to the personal element of the fighting, much like boxing, and creating a threat and setting the stage. And beat 'em ups as a genre have consistently been about working outside the system, cops and politicians versus injustice when they couldn't work within their own confines. Final Fight, the mayor, Mike Hagar, can't trust the cops because one of them is a bad guy. And this vigilantism when the state kind of falls apart. And at the same time, like in the 70s, New York had no money, so there was a lot of vigilantism like the Guardian Angels. And also Streets of Rage is a game about ex-cop vigilantes because they can't work in the confines of the law. The only thing is that the grittiness of the city and the use of urban themes is often just dressing. Sega and Capcom have both flirted with a fairly uncritical look of hip-hop and urban culture, but at the end they miss that key ingredient because the players are fighting for power, but who are the disenfranchised? It's never really communicated. Beat-em-ups, with their over-the-top gang violence and overarching bad guy plots, are missing the narrative through fair to make the game, to make the game interesting. Many of the other games reskin themselves to change their relevance, but the story is really a concern. In many ways, all beat-em-ups post the original Kunio are like this. The story is just a scroll of text, disconnected from the action, until it's time to hit start and to fight. So I'm going to skip all of this because God of War isn't interesting enough to talk about and go to the conclusion. So informing my practice, we're still in a world where things like this basically look exactly the same. And for me, designing a game with nonviolence in mind is not so simple. And by its virtue, pacifism achieved by a player without many stakes is fake and feels manipulative. There are limits to nonviolence, and those are set by your opponent. The state will use whatever tactics and violence that they can. As in real life, acting non-violently, but perhaps outside the rule structure of what state will allow. The state will bring violence and fully justify it by any means necessary. I'm working on this game because you can get catharsis through violence. The cop that's being thrown by the Mexican wrestler guy is based on the cop that sprayed all those kids at UCLA with his pepper spray in that famous picture. And this game also deals a lot with gentrification, deals with a lot of themes and it's okay. It's okay to make a game that centers around some form of violence, especially when you are actually critical of what you're doing and what you're actually fighting back against. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how games like Metal Gear or Dishonored sort of tackle possibilities of nonviolence?
It was basically how do you stand on like games like Metal Gear and Dishonored and how they take on nonviolence. I really like Metal Gear. I like the fact that you can play it the way that you want. It also questions itself. Metal Gear Rising actually has a moment where they make you think about the people that you're dismembering and they make you hear their thoughts, and I thought that was pretty great. Dishonored, actually the first time I met Harvey, I told him I didn't like Dishonored because a rat can can bite someone and they die, and then that's your fault, and that's kind of weird. And I think it's funny because the most interesting parts about Dishonored are the videos where you see someone using their powers to throw people in the air and juggle them with violence. And the stealth, I feel like, is not... The nonviolent part of the game is not actually all that interesting to me because it requires you to slow down, and it blames you for things that don't even have to do with you. If you scare somebody and they fall down, you're responsible for that. I haven't played the second one, but it's actually funny because me telling Harvey all those complaints about the game opened a dialogue between me and him, and we talk here and there. So, go Dishonored because their dev team actually thinks about these things too. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean that's like Undyne in Undertale is the state though, right? There's like two other cops and one of them messes with you here and there, but like it's kind of, it comes back to those, I don't know, there's this weird like ideal where because when you play Undertale, the whole point is that because you help out Undyne is actually a really nice person. Right, and you want to know about that stuff, so that's why and basically the whole well is poisoned from the very beginning when you find out, oh, if I do anything bad to anybody in this world, I'm not going to see the good ending. So then you keep just trying to see the good ending. So you're basically in a manipulated point from the very time that you begin playing the game. Undyne might as well be an army though, right? Like because it's like throwing all those giant spikes at you. It's like this thing as like a little child. Also, you're a child in the game. But that's where the theming starts to mash up against the fact that like I'm a real person playing this game, and I really like Undertale. I played 16 hours of it. I beat the whole thing. Nonviolent. I watched a lot of the. It's kind of weird that everyone calls it the genocide mode, but that one part, like that's when I started thinking about the game, and I was like, wait, this is actually fucked up, because. No, like the fact that if I walked away and didn't give this person water, I get the bad ending, that doesn't make any sense. That's one more act where you're like, oh, you helped kill this person. I'm like, I didn't kill this person. This person ran after me. They should suffer their own consequences. I mean, and again, it's like you could just brush off Undertale. It's a game but it has like huge range, and I think that, we have so many people playing this, you just have to be just a little bit more critical and think about it. I mean, it's like, again, I love the game, but yeah, it's very problematic in certain parts. Yeah, I think that's... Yeah. The question is about, is it okay, because in Punch-Out has stereotypes of black men, is it okay if there are more stereotypes? Well, first off, Little Mac is nobody, right? He's not stereotype, he's nothing. He's just a white kid from the Bronx. Like, he has zero anything. He's the player, and so there's no critical thing on the player. And, all the characters, I just think, my bigger thing is, I think, archetypes and stereotypes can be interesting to use as long as you are understanding how you are using them. And 1980s Capcom and Nintendo were not those people that were doing that. They were just kind of that like, haha, we're just going to do these things. Isn't this so funny? Also, Mike Tyson's not stereotypes because they paid for him to be on the cover, right? Like, so it's kind of... there's a lot of like, you gotta like look underneath and say where's the intent behind a lot of this thing, and it's like it's a game where you fight like a Pacific Islander by punching him in the stomach, and like it's just all these little things that, I mean, I think there is some form of being all right, but I mean that's like a conversation that I actually have with developers over email. I'm actually helping a game right now where it's a game that's about like basketball, and it's going to have a lot of stereotypical characters, but like it's all about what you're using and where the archetypes come from. But yeah, I mean that's a conversation that I like actually work with people and get paid to do afterwards. It's a very long conversation. But yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, that's my Twitter. Thank you.